There has been controversy over what is taught in our primary, middle and secondary schools as to what is appropriate and what is and isn't considered acceptable to teach to young people and impressionable minds. This impressive speech from former schoolteacher Matthew Roberts is revealing in that the content of some school curricula can be contrived to subtly influence children to accept dogma rather than encouraging them to question freely. And much of the content of each school year can be alarming to parents who are given no indicators of what information is being dished out to the very young. Many in the teaching profession say the state education system is ideologically manipulating youngsters and promoting a false narrative that can rob them of their cultural identity. Matthew Roberts felt the need to leave teaching, having clashed many times with school and college authorities who refuse to accept dissent from staff who disagree with teaching methods. His speech is from a 2017 London Forum event.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. It's fantastic to listen to one of the wonderful talks that we've had today. It's really encouraging and inspiring, and it's wonderful to be with white people. Isn't that fantastic? I'd just like to say that there is this perception, isn't there, that all teachers and college lecturers and university lecturers are liberal neo-Marxists and cultural Marxists. Well, that's true. Can I just say that there is one exception, and that is me. I am a nationalist, a racial nationalist, and I am proud of my roots and my heritage and my identity. And I stand against the tide of political correctness in the education system. Now, today I just want to share a few thoughts with you about developments in the education system that I think are quite sinister. Many of you may know about these already, but I'm going to share them with you and hopefully give you some insight into what's happening in the state education system. Now, from September 2016, the Oxford and Cambridge examination boards are going to introduce into the school curriculum and into the FE curriculum a new history module, and it's called Migration to Britain circa 2000-2010, and this is to be part of the new history GCSE course. Now, this course has been put together by, wait for it, Black and Asian Studies Associations in order to address white male-dominated views of history. This work is mainly the work of Marxist academics and will be offered to thousands of students throughout England and Britain from this September onwards. That is what is happening in our education system. How is it that Black and Asian Studies Associations can put together curriculums for our children because they think that our history somehow has a white paradigm, a white dominant effect? Please, if only. If you go into the universities and you go into the colleges of FE, all the history that is taught is utterly anti-white and multicultural and revisionist. And so our great historical achievements are rarely given the credit that they deserve. That's if they're discussed at all. Now, one of the topics on offer in this module is a section called Africans in Britain. This section is going to teach English children in English schools that Africans were here before their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. The opening sentence in this section states this. This is what it says. The Africans were here before the arrival of the English. Now, why do they say that? Well, these Marxist historians are arguing that Africans were part of the Roman legions stationed around Hadrian's Wall in the 3rd century, before the arrival of Germanic tribes. The course literature states, this course will enable the students to learn how the movement of people, European, African and Asian, to and from these islands has shaped the story of this nation for thousands of years. So you can see where this is going. It's all about we are a nation of immigrants. That's the propaganda that's being fed to your grandchildren, your children, and our young people up and down this country. Now, of course, this is a gross distortion of history, as the legions referred to during this time didn't settle in England, and they moved on after their duties were performed. It's also not the case that there were no Anglo-Saxons in Britain at that time. There were settlements in the east of the country long before the Romans came here. It's also the case that a group called the Batavians were part of the invasion force of Plautius in 43 AD. But the Marxists in this country and those that put the curriculums together do not allow the facts to get in the way. Their desire is to ideologically manipulate the minds of our children, and that is all they are concerned about. They're not particularly concerned about historical facts. That's not the point. The point is to make our children feel that they are growing up in a country that has always been a country of immigrants, and that they should celebrate that, okay, and inherit that multicultural nightmare that the left wants to impose upon them. Now, this is an example of what's happening in schools and colleges in the UK. There is no question that the curriculum is increasingly reflecting the demographic changes that are taking place in the country. And that those responsible for deciding what is taught to our young people are enthusiastically setting about to make the curriculum relevant to new and existing immigrant demographics. The education, quite frankly, the education system is simply now a tool in the hands of those who want to socially engineer us out of existence. Another example of how history is distorted and taught to our young people is the way that the African slave trade is taught. Children are taught about the transatlantic slave trade from a kind of black victim perspective. This assumes that blacks were simply passive recipients, simply victims of nasty white slavers who forced them from their ancestral homelands. However, what you won't find in these lessons is the fact that there is no mention made of how African chiefs actually controlled the trade, or how Africans were taken from the interior of Africa by their fellow Africans in tribal wars, or how the African chiefs sent delegations to Europe to try to get the slave restored again once the British had abolished it. And what did they say? We want you to restore the slave trade because it's part of our culture and part of our history. And of course they were right. Slavery has always been part of African culture and part of African history. Something else that our Marxist teachers won't inform our children about is the Arab slave trade and the horrors of the Arab slave trade, which lasted longer than the transatlantic slave trade and killed more people, and more people were taken into slavery. Isn't it interesting that they're prepared to talk at great length to make our children feel guilty by constantly going on about the transatlantic slave trade, yet they won't talk about the sub-Saharan slave trade or the Arabic slave trade? I wonder why. Could it possibly be that these perpetrators were not white? The way the slave trade is taught reinforces an already existing victim mentality in black students and promotes a sense of shame in some white students. It's also, as far as I'm aware or concerned, the start of the process of the inculcation of white guilt and the development of a cultural Marxist worldview, in which many white students develop a self-loathing and hatred of their country. The groundwork for these developments are laid in the early school and college years and are further reinforced in the institutions of higher education. A distorted view of history is also now being taught in relation to the history of Europe. Thank God we're out. In schools around the continent. This is done to push further EU integration. Professor David from Cambridge University, he's a university don, recently argued that millions of children are being taught a distorted view of history of the European Union and indeed Europe that deliberately promotes further integration. Textbooks are papering over past differences between European nations in favour of a misleading idea of European citizenship. He states, "The search for common roots has not been ignored in Brussels and among its acolytes. School textbooks are issued that attempt to present the history of Europe as a common enterprise." And why are they doing this? Why do they want to present the idea that we've always been able to get on with each other as Europeans and that we've always been well integrated? Well, because they want our children to accept the European Union. They want our children to be pro-European. They want our children to see themselves as Europeans rather than English or British. And of course, what does that mean in reality? What it means is more political union, more fiscal union, more mass immigration, and the consistent destruction of the nation state. That's what it's all about. And it's not just happening in Britain, it's happening throughout Europe. Now, what is also of great concern to me, as it should be to you, is the distorted and sanitised politically correct version of Islam that's being taught in schools today. Muhammad is presented as some kind of kind, merciful and generous man who did wonderful deeds, as opposed to the bloodthirsty and murdering warlord that he actually was. He is presented as a victim of Meccan persecution and injustice, when in fact he sowed division and conflict and eventually war. The bloody history of jihad is simply ignored or presented as wonderful military victories against the enemies of Islam. Our children are thus dangerously deceived, making them vulnerable to the pro-Muslim religion of peace garbage that's taught in our schools and through the media. In my view, Europe is about to enter decades of conflict and terror as a result of Islam. We know who's behind it. We've had a lot of discussions about that today. But that does not take away from the fact that Islam represents an existential threat. We should not be teaching our children that it is benign. In fact, I don't believe that we should be teaching about it at all. Again, the educational political elites are desperately trying to project the view that Islam is somehow a part of Europe, that we can live together. Just overcome Islamophobia and everything will be okay. After all, it's just a minority who have hijacked this peaceful religion. They're the problem, not Islam itself. Well, I beg to differ. British teachers are also reluctant, increasingly, to discuss the medieval crusades, in which Christians fought Muslim armies for the control of Jerusalem. Lessons often contradict what is taught in the local mosques. And I personally have had Muslim students approach me about the crusades, talking to me about how evil they are and how evil Europe is. What they are being taught in the mosques is a completely distorted view of the Crusades, which reinforces the Muslim victim mentality and further promotes their grievance narrative. Not helped, of course, when liberals tell them how wicked the Crusaders were. Now, some people worry about the creeping Islamisation of our country, and they absolutely are right to do that. But there is also a creeping Islamisation of the curriculum. I've noticed this just over the past few years. Fortunately, others too are waking up to these sinister developments. Now, there's a pressure group called the Campaign for Real Education, and usually they're quite conservative. They don't usually make politically incorrect statements or say anything that's going to rock the boat. However, recently, their chairman, Chris McGovern, made this statement. The country, that's our country, is being sold down the river by the politically correct brigade, and national identity sacrificed for minority groups to feel included. It is pro-immigration propaganda, he says. Professor Alan Smithers, Buckingham University, a specialist advisor to the Commons Education Committee, said recently, speaking of the new history module, the one that I was talking about earlier, this seems to be aimed more at indoctrination than education. It is dangerous because a cohesive society depends on an authentic shared view of history. Now, there is no question that almost everything that is taught in schools and colleges today is infected with cultural Marxism. The ideology of political correctness and multiculturalism is all pervasive throughout the curriculum, as is the concept of equality and diversity. And you know what? If children come out of the education system after 16 to 18 years, not knowing much about maths and English, you can all comfortably rest assured that they'll have a fantastic understanding about the ideology of anti-racism. Now, in efforts to counter Islamophobia in British schools, teachers are now required to teach key Muslim contributions such as algebra and the number zero in maths and science courses, even though the concept of zero originated in India. Other sinister developments in the education system are widespread. In East London, in the Tower Hamlets district, 4 Muslims were jailed in 2012 for attacking a local white teacher who gave religious lessons to Muslim girls. You see, there's no gender equality or multiculturalism or diversity for them. Yeah? 85 out of 90 schools have implemented no pork policies, including my own. Schools across Britain are increasingly banning pork from lunch menus to avoid offending Muslim students. It is the default position. Hundreds have a no pork policy. These culinary restrictions join a long list of politically correct changes that are gradually bringing hundreds of British primary and secondary school children into conformity with Islamic Sharia law. The political correctness and compliance with Sharia manifests itself in other ways. This is supposed to be a Christian country. We've had talk about that today. And yet, increasingly, huge numbers of schools are abandoning the nativity plays every December and having other cultural events. They're giving them different names, but they are not Christian. Wherever one stands in relation to religion, one has to appreciate that Christianity, whatever one thinks of it, is an integral part of our culture. Okay? All right? Personally, I'm a pagan. But actually, Christianity is interwoven into the very fabric of our society and our culture. Therefore, that must be reflected in our schools. Our children have the right to understand part of their cultural heritage. But increasingly, too many of them are not taking part in nativity plays. Now, you often think that these are just stories from the press. Well, they're not, I can tell you. This is what is happening. There is too much emphasis in the education system on equality and diversity, cultural diversity, multiculturalism, and historical falsehoods. And this is having a detrimental effect on our young people, particularly those from working class backgrounds. The evidence suggests from all recent studies that white working class children are being marginalised at school because they are being fed a diet of multiculturalism. And they're being fed a diet of diversity that shuns British traditions. According to the research, large numbers of schools follow a curriculum that celebrates a diverse range of pupils while sidelining those from British families. Now, a recent study that you can all look up is the Lambeth Council study, which was taking place, I think, in 2014. You can Google that. And this is a really interesting study, the Lambeth study, because these people are not nationalists, yeah, down at Lambeth. There are a lot of cultural Marxists down there, and a kind of mongrelized kind of group of people who hate white people. Let's be honest about this. They produced a study, and these are some of the conclusions. The report stated that white British pupils from deprived homes often cannot see themselves or their lives reflected in the curriculum, turning them off school altogether. Isn't that interesting? White British working class pupils cannot see themselves or their lives reflected in a British curriculum. What is going on? What is happening here? Okay? These conclusions come amid growing concerns that working class children are lagging dramatically behind at school and now perform worse than any other group. According to figures recently, just 32.3% of poor white children left school in the summer of 2014 with 5 A to C grades at GCSE. Poor children from every other group performed better, with more than 3/4 of poor Chinese pupils and 61.5% of those from deprived Indian families achieving the best results. The parents of these white working class children are aware of the problem, according to the report. It states that, and I quote, "Many of these parents lamented a lack of white culture reflected in school life. Just think about that. Many of these parents reflected a lack of white culture, or lamented a lack of white culture reflected in school life, which perpetuated for many the marginalisation they felt in their communities. So this marginalisation is reinforced by the fact that not only are these children minorities in their schools, but they are also minorities in their neighbourhoods. And that is reflected in the concerns that their parents have. Neighbourhoods, let's be honest about this, neighbourhoods that no longer have an English character or an English feel. Neighbourhoods in which the culture is not their own. The cultural framework that these children, our children, are exposed to is a black urban culture, or an Islamic culture, or a Turkish culture, or a mixture of all three, depending on which part of London that you live in. Yeah. And that's the state of the situation for many of our children. They're minorities at school, they're minorities in their communities. Their culture is not reflected in the curriculum, and their culture is not reflected in their neighbourhoods. And we wonder why many of these children are going off school, are concerned or not concerned about what's being taught. The report stated that head teachers in London told its researchers that they ran numerous projects, such as Black History Month and cultural days, to raise awareness of countries such as Portugal, Poland and Jamaica. One head teacher told the researchers that the curriculum that has been on offer has not been meeting the needs of white British pupils, and that this has led to them losing their identity. One has to ask what's going on in this country when our children are losing their identity simply because the curriculum that they are subject to doesn't say anything about their story, their lives, their country, their heritage, their culture. It's an absolute disgrace. However, it's not just what's going on in schools, is it? I mean, this is true, but they would lose their identity anyway because their identity has no value to the cultural Marxists, who prefer to fill our cities, quite frankly, with immigrants, rather than have our cities resembling anything Anglo-Saxon or English. Another head teacher told the researchers that it seems easier to celebrate the good things about other cultures, the dance, the food, the stories, and to ask parents to come in and share their food and their traditions with us. We have worked through all the cultures and have left the British one to last. You know, what never ceases to amaze me is the passion and enthusiasm shown by many in the teaching profession to promote multiculturalism and diversity. It's almost a religious fanaticism. The collapse of Christianity has been replaced by the worship of diversity at the altar of multiculturalism. The problem is our children's identity and heritage is being sacrificed on that altar. Another teacher contemptuously stated, there is always that difficulty in identifying what British culture is. How many of our pupils would understand what dancing around the maypole is all about? Well, if dancing around the maypole is explained to children, then they will understand what it's all about. I used to dance around the maypole when I was at primary school, and actually the maypole represents much of our history and our heritage and our culture. There's a lot that's attached to it. But the problem is this: if ethnic children can't understand our traditions and it's not relevant to them, then why do these educationists think that we should be interested in their traditions? Because their traditions are no longer relevant to us. If our children can't understand ethnic traditions, right? Well, why should we teach them, right? And it seems to me that we've got to learn about other traditions and other customs, but actually other groups don't need to learn about ours because ours are somehow not relevant to them. That's what's going on. Another head teacher told the researchers how Caribbean, Polish and Portuguese families had a greater sense of cultural identity, but, listen to this, nothing binds white children together. I mean, the ignorance displayed in that statement is breathtaking, quite frankly. We have one of the richest cultural heritages in the world, and our children were very much bound together just a few decades ago before the criminals who captured our education system and our cultural institutions set about destroying any identity that white children had, especially English children. Now, studies of this kind have been replicated several times, and the similar conclusions have been reached. That is to say that the multicultural curriculum privileges ethnic learners and disprivileges native children, thus creating feelings of marginalisation and alienation amongst British children, who no longer feel that the education system is relevant to them, because it does not speak to them or acknowledge their history, cultural heritage or identity. So how can it be that the native children of this country no longer see themselves, their lives, their history, their cultural heritage reflected in the curriculum, in their own schools, in their own country? And why is it that so many working class kids underperform in our schools? Well, it's because, as I stated earlier, the cultural Marxists have captured this and every other information institution in our society, and they are using it for social engineering purposes, and quite frankly they couldn't give a damn about our children, provided that their wet dream of some multicultural utopia is realised. Since the 1960s Cultural Revolution, the education system has become a vehicle for social engineering, and its capture by the liberal left, the cultural Marxists, those people who are ethnic-loving, mongrelized society creating, white-hating traitors, have transformed our education system to promote their utopian version of multiculturalism and race displacement. That ultimately is what it's all about. The education system has become utterly politicised and in many respects is no longer fit for purpose. One thing that we nationalists must do when we get our hands on the levers of power is to rid the education system of the priests of political correctness. They have got to go, and then there must be a cultural renaissance. There must be a cultural renaissance where we start to teach our children once again about their wonderful Anglo-Saxon British history and culture. Where is it? Go around the cities today. Walk through Tottenham, walk through Hackney, walk through Tower Hamlets. What are these kids exposed to? They're not exposed to English culture. There's no English character to these cities. It's gone. These children have been culturally dispossessed. Their heritage has been stripped away from them. And the people that have done this must pay the highest price. It breaks my heart. It really does. You know, sometimes I just want to walk out of class. I just want to walk out of my institution where I work because it's utterly depressing. But the thing that keeps me going is this, that one day I know that these people will pay a price. Yes. These people will pay a price for what they're doing to our children. Now, the prevailing ideology in recent decades, maybe probably from the 1960s onwards, that has underpinned all educational policies, egalitarianism. That word, egalitarianism. You hear it everywhere in the institutions of education. The belief that all students and all people are somehow equally gifted, that they have equal potential. That's the prevailing philosophy that underpins the education system in this country. Just create the right kind of environment in which all people can flourish, and you'll have an artist, a poet, a scientist, a musician on every street corner. Rid the world of discrimination and inequality, and people become masters of their own destiny, and you can become whatever you like. Well, no, you can't. It's false, utterly false, and it does a lot of damage to children. Human beings are not equipotential, they are different. They have different inherited biological traits, and they are limited in what they can achieve depending on those traits. Some people are fat, and I don't have to worry about saying that here, do I? I don't have to worry about saying, oh, you can't say that. I mean, if I said that in my staff room, right, they'd ask me to walk out. Right? It's great. Some people are fat. Yeah? And some people are thin. Some people are good looking. Others are not. Some people can run fast and others can't. Some people have high IQs and others don't. Some people will do very well academically and others won't. Some people will have great vocational skills, others won't. People can't help who they are. They have no control over their genome they have inherited or the parents that they have inherited. And it's wrong to make judgments about people's worth as human beings because everybody can make a contribution. And there is a place for all in our communities. But the idea that all people are equally talented is dangerous nonsense and has been utterly refuted by behavioural genetics and the study of IQ distributions. Now, why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because under the old O-level and A-level system, only 20% of students ended up going to university. And the cultural Marxists saw this as elitism and discriminatory. Insufficient numbers were attaining the 5 O-levels, including English and Maths, and the 3 A-levels for university entrance. So rather than set about trying to improve results through more effective teaching and better educational provision, they simply dumbed the system down. That's what they did. They dumbed it down so that all can have prizes. It was argued that at the time that coming out of school with no qualifications undermined self-esteem. How often we hear about self-esteem in the education system these days. We cannot allow students to leave college or schools without any qualifications at all because that would damage their self-esteem. So what we do is we give them qualifications that are worthless and that they can't get jobs with anyway, and that does more damage to their self-esteem. This idea that all must have prizes, that all people can become whatever they want to become, provided that we create the right kind of environment in which they can develop, is nonsense. Now, I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't have opportunities to realise what talents and potential they have. Of course they should. But in any race, there are winners and there are losers. Okay, and people who are successful academically and go on to do well, good luck to them. But there will be people who are not successful academically and will not go on to do well. And what we need to do in the education system is to work out what a student's potential is. What is this student capable of? What is this student's potential? Where do the strengths lie in this particular student? And then bring out as best we can the talents that that student has, given the biological limitations that that student has inherited. That's what we can do. We cannot be promising them the world because that just lets them down and gives them terrible feelings of inadequacy. I've seen it too often. We have to be honest, and we have to have an education system that meets the needs of all students and recognise that the needs of students are very different. Student A's needs may be very different from student B's needs, but we meet both needs. Yeah? We don't pretend that everybody can achieve the same thing. It's false. It's been utterly refuted, this idea about egalitarianism and equipotentiality. Okay, now GCSEs have replaced the old O-levels, and there is now universal agreement that these qualifications have proved to be far less robust than their predecessors. The same has been said for A-levels, which became modular and gave students the opportunity to sit exams a second time if they failed the first time round. When I did my A-levels, you studied for 2 years, you did 2 3-hour exams, and that was it. And if you failed, you had to wait about 4 months because you'd take them again. But not now, because of the modularity that's been introduced. So you can try again until you get at least a grade. Studies compared O and A levels taken 40 years ago and compared them to current GCSE and A-level exams and concluded that students getting grade A's for results today would have received C's or D's back then, depending on the subject taken. Now, if you dumb the educational system down so that all can have prizes, then those prizes or qualifications are worthless, as many employers will testify. And the quality of the workforce will deteriorate, contributing to poorer economic performance and poorer services, as many consumers will testify. But you know what? Maybe, just maybe, the dumbing down process isn't the worst thing. Okay? Maybe it's the fact that the education system is now used to dispossess our children of their cultural heritage and identity. One of the things that makes me hate, and I love to say that word now because we can say it now, can't we? Yeah? I hate. Hallelujah. I hate, and I do. I hate cultural Marxists. I hate them. I hate them, and I want them all destroyed. With their pernicious ideology. Now, one of the reasons why I hate cultural Marxism, I loathe it, is because the main victims of cultural Marxism are our children, the innocents, those little ones who cannot challenge it, because it's fed to them like a poison in nursery and primary school. Yeah? They're its main victims because they're robbed of their cultural heritage and their identity. All other groups are taught to be proud of their cultural heritage. Our children are told that there's no such race as the English, that they're just a mongrel people. Our children are being taught a politically correct and distorted view of history in order to prepare them for their dispossession. That's the bottom line, folks. One way to reduce resistance to the multicultural nightmare and the cultural dispossession of our people is to make our children feel guilty. And the Liberals are very good at this. And this is another reason why I hate them. One way this is done is to inform them, especially our young, going into the universities, that their ancestors were wicked and evil and responsible for genocide, slavery and racism. Young people don't have the experience or the knowledge to critically evaluate these things. They look up to these professors who have written books, and they look up to them admiringly. And these are young 18, 19-year-olds. They don't have the knowledge or the experience or the understanding to be able to turn around and say, well, actually, you're wrong, mate, okay, because of A, B and C. They haven't yet acquired that critical thinking and that knowledge. So they're like putty, really, in the hands of the priesthood, yeah? The politically correct lecturers. But their day will come. Oh no, it will. Now, of course, not all of our young people are passive recipients of this brainwashing process, as recent developments show. Many of our young people are resisting cultural Marxist ideas, for example, the identitarian movement, and many of the recently emerging groups have spoken at this forum. However, the revisionist and distorted history that I've spoken about in this talk and the inculcation of white guilt are powerful forces, and they must be challenged if we are to bring young people into the nationalist fold. Just as an aside, the inculcation of guilt into the young and not so young white people probably takes its most extreme form, and it's been mentioned here today, in the United States with the white privilege studies. Heard of white privilege studies? Here, young and not so young are told that they had privileges simply because they are white. Privileges that non-whites don't have.
Good.
Fantastic. For example, whites who subscribe to this garbage inform us that they are privileged because when they walk into a shop, they don't get stared at or followed around by the security people like blacks? Well, my answer to that is this. If blacks were not overrepresented in the crime statistics, right, for theft and burglary, neither would they. Do they follow Chinese or Asian people around these shops? No. And why would that be? Well, because their crime rates for burglary and theft among these groups is statistically insignificant. That's why. This is the most grotesque form of white self-loathing I've ever seen. I mean, look it up on the internet. Google it, watch it, and weep. It's sickening, really, and demonstrates just how lost some of our people are. However, from a cultural Marxist perspective, this is just what's required. A guilt-ridden white population, ideologically manipulated into a revisionist history to facilitate the cultural and racial dispossession of white people so that we hand over our ancestral homelands to aliens and immigrants. Somehow, we have to recapture these information institutions, the education system, media, and other institutions from the cultural left. It took them decades to march through these institutions and capture them. Folks, we don't have decades. Time is against us. However, what we can do is we can teach our children about our history and our culture. And I would suggest that all patriotic parents and grandparents spend time with their children and do what they can to teach them about our history. You don't have to be a history buff. There's lots of good stuff that you can access on the internet for children. It's simple, you can convey it to them, okay, and teach them about our history. If you're not teaching them about our history and our culture, then quite frankly, you're part of the problem. All right? I would say to all of you who have nephews and nieces, children and grandchildren, don't let the criminals make your children feel guilty. Don't let them make your children feel a sense of shame. Teach them to love their country, to be proud of their history, and be proud of their race. And teach them to be proud of who they are. It's very important. And hopefully, those children and the young people that are growing up today will grow up to be the nationalists and patriots of tomorrow. And they will wreak havoc on those cultural Marxist traitors for what they've done to our country.